As we learned previously, anti-Semitism is first and foremost a spiritual battle, a deep hatred against the God of Israel and the Jewish people as a key part of God's plan of salvation. Sadly, this hatred didn't end with the birth of Jesus or with the start of the early church. The nations continued to rage. What if I told you that one of the darkest chapters in the history of anti-Semitism is that of the church and the Jewish people? Sounds unbelievable, right? It's often said that the very pages that Christians have torn from their history books are the ones that the Jewish people have memorized. In fact, the first display at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, shows how the Holocaust was perpetrated in part due to the hateful teachings of Christian leaders like Martin Luther. The very first thing that they want us to know is that anti-Judaism in Christian Europe played a significant role in the Holocaust. Now, we can be quick to say, but those weren't real Christians. Yet we have to acknowledge that from a Jewish perspective, it's important enough to display at the entrance exhibit at Yad Vashem. As those who desire to know God's heart and to reflect His love, we would be wise to be empathetic and to take an honest look at church history and ask, how did the church get so far away from the origins of our Jewish Messiah? How could anti-Semitism ever even take root in Christianity? Let's take a look at some of this history, starting with the birth of the early church and some of the theological developments that took place, and then leading up to the complex fusion of church and state. God's promise to Abraham to bless all nations through his seed would come through Jesus. The hope of salvation began to spread throughout the world. Yet, the early church wrestled with identity issues of Jew and Gentile together in Messiah, as many of the new Gentile believers were unfamiliar with the Jewish context of the gospel. The apostles were clear. Gentiles didn't need to become Jewish or to practice certain laws and customs in order to be a part of God's family of faith. Yet, as the gospel reached further to more nations and more people, the church grew distant from its Jewish origins. This was one of many factors that led to anti-Semitism within the church. The early church was predominantly Jewish, but sadly, most of Israel rejected her Messiah. This led church leaders like Justin Martyr and Origen to conclude that if the Jews rejected God, perhaps God had rejected them. Misguided church leaders like Augustine spread the lie that all Jewish people were responsible for the death of Jesus and should be condemned. John Chrysostom, the golden-tongued preacher, also blamed the Jews, saying, "You did slay Christ. You did lift violent hands against the Lord's anointed. You did spill these precious drops, replete with saving power." Twisting various scriptures like Matthew 27:25, "His blood be upon us and on our children." This led to the accusation that all Jews were guilty of deicide or killing God. Yet the truth is that Jesus himself forgave his killers while on the cross, and he laid down his life willingly to save all. In 70 AD, the Second Temple was destroyed and intense persecution under Rome began to break out. Jews were soon expelled from the land. This seemed to confirm that God had revoked his covenant with Israel. In order to distinguish itself from Judaism and to avoid persecution, the early Christian community further separated from the Jews. Theology, which was hammered out in early church councils over time, severed Christianity from its Jewish roots. Now, with no physical kingdom of Israel and with Jewish people scattered among the nations, church leaders began to reinterpret and allegorize scripture, calling the church the new or the spiritual Israel. Origen, who was a 2nd century church leader, said, "The church, that is, the assembly of the elect, has replaced Israel." This false belief even further widened the gap between Jews and Christians and stoked anti-Judaism in the church. Replacement theology or supersessionism claims that God is finished with national and ethnic Israel and has transferred all of Israel's promises to the church. This implies that Israel is left with the curses of the broken Mosaic covenant, while the church is heir to the blessings once promised to the Jews. This dangerous belief, held by church leaders from Origen to Augustine, John Calvin to Martin Luther, brought prejudice and outright persecution against Jews for centuries. For if replacement theology is actually true, it logically follows that there remains no distinct redemptive future for national or ethnic Israel, and believers would actually be in line with God to help him out in rejecting the Jews. So we start to see then how anti-Semitism began to take root in the church. The stage was now set for anti-Judaism to be not just in belief or in words, but to be carried out in practice. How? Through the fusion of church and empire. Early Christianity, yoked to the power of Constantine's Roman Empire, brought severe Jewish persecution and a great division between Gentile and Jewish believers. For years to come, Christianization by force would become a dominant church characteristic, leading to state-sanctioned anti-Semitism. Backed by the power of empires, early church councils further separated Judaism and Christianity, barring association with or marriage between Jews and Christians, restricting synagogue activity and the celebration of Jewish holidays or traditions, and even segregating Jews into ghettos. Instead of choosing Christ by faith, state-empowered religion used forced conversion for religious and for political conquest. Sadly, much of Christian history was written with the pen of the Gentiles in the blood of the Jews. This was very evident in the anti-Jewish zeal of 11th century Europe. The Crusades were bloody church-backed missions that aimed to reclaim the Holy Land from the grip of Islam. Yet the Crusades also marked a turning point in Jewish-Christian relations and a pattern of violence and persecution that would endure for centuries. Jews were labeled en masse as Christ killers, and evil slogans like "kill a Jew and save your soul" ran rampant. This deep hatred led to unspeakable Jewish suffering. This remains one of the darkest periods of anti-Semitic violence and prejudice fueled by religious zeal. The 15th century Spanish Inquisition was another grievous period of church anti-Semitism. Accusations of Jewish power and disloyalty and blood libels forced Spanish Jews to either convert under force or to be expelled from Spain. Thousands fled, many were tortured, and countless converted under duress, bringing a tragic end to generations of Jewish civilization in Spain. The Catholic Church enforced these discriminatory laws and segregated Jews into ghettos, making them wear distinct clothing and symbols. Anti-Jewish church policies were an evil that would continue in the days ahead. Now, we have to understand that in the Middle Ages, people had limited exposure to the Bible. Only the clergy and the educated elite had access to the Latin texts, and most of the people were actually illiterate. God's promises to the Jewish people in history and in prophecy were known only to the degree that church leaders taught them. This began to change, however, during the Renaissance and the Reformation, as scholars and monks like Erasmus and Luther began to translate Bible into the common languages. We cannot underestimate the value of knowing God's heart through His Word. At this point, Christian love for the Jewish people began to revive as the Bible became more widely available with the invention of the printing press in the 15th century and through the events of the Protestant Reformation led by Martin Luther. Now, evangelicals tend to have a very positive view of Martin Luther as a key leader in the Protestant Reformation. Yet, what they might not realize is that Luther, who at first hoped to evangelize the Jews, later turned against them drastically. Frustrated by the challenge of reaching Jewish people with the gospel, Luther wrote in a pamphlet called On the Jews and Their Lies. This content deeply influenced Nazi ideology. Luther advised setting fire to Jewish synagogues and schools, destroying their homes, taking away their prayer books and their writings, abolishing safe conduct for Jewish people on the highways, and stripping them of all cash and treasure, silver and gold. He said to put an axe or a hoe in the hands of strong young Jews and Jewesses and let them earn their bread by the sweat of their brow. By the end of his life, Luther had even said, "The Jews, surely rejected by God, are no longer His people, and neither is He any longer their God. We are at fault in not slaying them." Luther's cruel advice on how to deal with the Jewish people would tragically come to pass in the days ahead. Stirred up by false accusations and propaganda like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, Jewish communities were violently destroyed as riots swept across 19th and 20th century Europe and Russia. These deadly pogroms often took place on Christmas or on Easter when they were incited by church leaders. Jews were persecuted, dehumanized, and labeled as a societal evil to be dealt with. In 20th century Germany, Lutheran theologian Gerard Kittel declared the need for a radical solution to the Jewish problem, and he even endorsed the Nazi agenda. Generations of anti-Semitism had created a toxic climate that culminated in the horrors of the Holocaust. Under the Nazis, long-standing Jewish stereotypes became a racist ideology that led to the inferno of the death camps and the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children across Europe. This genocide, built on the warped theories of racial supremacy and, unfortunately, with the complicity of much of the church, remains the most sinister example of unchecked anti-Semitism in history. While some church leaders like Dietrich Bonhoeffer actively opposed the Nazis, much of the church shamefully cooperated or remained silent in these days. Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel said, "There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest." Yet even from the ashes of the Holocaust came a glimmer of hope. God's promises declared through the Hebrew prophets would be fulfilled to restore, regather, and replant the Jewish people into their homeland for his name's sake, that the nations would know that he is God. Israel was miraculously reborn, first in the natural, and soon, we believe, in the spiritual. This story, it's not over, both the glorious parts and some very difficult ones to come. The nations still rage against the God of Israel and the Jewish people. From Haman to Herod, Hitler to Hamas, there has been an unrelenting attack against God's chosen means to usher in his plan of redemption, both in Jesus' first coming and his imminent return. History testifies that ignorance, apathy, flawed theology, and unchecked prejudice planted the seeds of anti-Semitism that bore bitter fruit over the years. Dr. Michael Brown, a Jewish theologian, says the church still owes the Jews the actual proof of Christianity's truth. Is it surprising that the Jewish people are such an insensitive and barren field for the gospel? The church itself has drenched it in blood and then heaped stones upon it. Deep, repentant love is the only cure. Scripture affirms God's covenant faithfulness to Israel. Though disciplined for unbelief, Israel remains beloved and elect for the sake of the patriarchs. God's gifts and calling are irrevocable. His covenant promises are rooted in grace, not in merit or in works that can be forfeited. Despite partial hardening, Scripture foresees the future redemption of Israel, for God remains faithful to his word. The motto, "Never Again," must be a conviction that reflects both our theology and our practical commitment to action. As believers, we can choose to partner with God's enduring love and his purposes for Israel and for the Jewish people. May this be the prevailing legacy of the church.